My consult on capital punishment was birthed through a conversation with a colleague as we drove from Clemson, South Carolina to Atlanta, Georgia. Shauna asked me a series of questions about why I was interested in studying violence, pulling me back to my freshman year of undergrad, where I first confronted my ideologies about death and violence. Prior to this puncture as a freshman, I adamantly believed in the violence of the death penalty as appropriate justice for wrongdoers. But when I began to explore the issue for an assignment in my ethics class, my worldview was shaken, and all kinds of questions about violence began to haunt me. I could not rid myself of these questions about the intersection of violence and justice, and I continued to study them in my master's program, exploring the relationship to location and faith, both of which I pick up in the consult.
With the death penalty, it's one of those things that a lot of people don't think a whole lot about, but the more you start looking at it, the more troubling it gets, especially when we look at our racial history, the legacy of slavery and racism. Where executions are happening right now is exactly where lynchings were happening 100 years ago. And the states that have held on to the death penalty the longest are the states that held on to slavery the longest. The 85% of executions in the last few decades have been in the Bible Belt. My buddy says the Bible Belt is the death belt, and wherever Christians have been most concentrated is where the death penalty has flourished.
It made sense for me to study the death penalty in South Carolina, a state with one of the darkest histories regarding executions. I discovered that South Carolina is home to the youngest execution to take place, a 14-year-old black boy who was accused of killing 2 white girls. He was exonerated 70 years after his death. George Steiny was not the first or the last person to be wrongfully convicted and killed under the scourge of the death penalty in America. It's no secret that race and socioeconomic status play significant roles in these executions, and this became a large part of what drove me to consult and explore these issues. The final and most significant layer of my consult centers on the death of a Clemson RCID student, Jody Corley, who worked with my mentor, Victor Villanueva, at Washington State University. Jody's story was connected to both the location and the education facets of my consult, and I shaped the second half of my consult to memorialize her death. Her partner, Scott, was murdered by 2 of her neighbors in Seneca, South Carolina. Jody fervently argued for the young men to not receive the death penalty, even though they had committed grievous crimes against her and Scott. Jody took her own life shortly after the 2 men were sentenced to prison. The consult works to connect the problems of the death penalty with the personal realities of stories such as Jody's.